Video games have been on the rise for a long time now, and a whopping 2.69 billion people in the world identify as gamers. People are spending more hours on video games, and the video game industry is predicted to be worth over $300 billion by 2025. Despite all that, given that video games are a relatively recent invention, there haven't been many studies done on video games and gamers, and there's still some old misconceptions floating around in mainstream media and in public opinion. Now, I've been meaning to make this episode for a long time because I like video games, and I used to be quite the avid gamer. I've played a lot of video games ever since I was a kid, and I've clocked in almost 2,000 hours on most of the games I used to play. And today, I'll be tackling 2 misconceptions that non-gamers have about video games, and hopefully we'll learn some new things along the way too. So the first misconception I want to tackle is that video games cause violence. This has been perpetrated by the media for the longest of times, and even Trump has blamed video games for the rise in mass shootings in the US. And the first case of this would be the tragic Columbine High School shooting by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Harris and Klebold were known to play the violent shooter Doom, and there were some false rumors about how they made a map of their school within this game as practice for the real thing. Now, I just want to point out that among other things, these two were bullied and rejected from regular social life. And it's also convenient that the media blamed just about everything those two were a part of, like metal music and psychiatric medicine. Now, as a quick note, I've read a portion of their diaries, which have been published online, and I think it's worth reading if you're curious about what was going on through their minds. And you can find it on the first link in the sources. Do be warned though, the content is a little graphic and disturbing, so it's not for the faint of heart. So I want to talk about violence and aggression. Now, I've said this for all kinds of emotions, and it holds true for violence and aggression. It's that it must have been useful to us in some way throughout our evolutionary history. Emotions and behaviors that have stood the test of time have been and may still be important for our survival. And violence is really no different. Prehistoric humans had to be aggressive and assertive when they were dealing with other tribes, other potential mates, dangerous animals, and all sorts of things. And you see that the homicide rate of modern-day prehistoric tribes are among the highest in the world. So the first thing to remember is that emotions and behaviors last for a reason. Now, the next thing to remember has to do with correlation. And there have been quite a few studies trying to find the relation between violence and video games, but they've all gotten mixed results, and the design of the experiments has been called into question. As an example, some studies simulate aggressive behavior by measuring how likely someone is to make someone else eat more hot sauce. Yes, this is exactly the same thing that causes people to go around shooting things. Now, at best, people have found a positive correlation of 0.3 between violence and video games, which is considered a weak correlation within psychology. But for some reason, the media loves reporting on this one little finding, all the while ignoring any talk of the flaws of the experiment and, most importantly, all the other studies that came up with either zero correlation or even a negative one, which would imply that video games reduce violence. Now, the point is, us scientists don't have a clear consensus on the topic, but the media still portrays it as if we do. Now, the next thing to note is that correlation does not equal causation. Ice cream sales are highly correlated with shark attacks. But you'd be silly to say that ice cream sales cause shark attacks. Ice cream sales just mean that there are more people hanging around beaches, and thus shark attacks are more likely to happen. There's always another factor that we have to consider. Even if they were to find any sort of positive correlation between video games and violence, that wouldn't mean that video games cause violence. It could be that naturally violent people tend to gravitate towards playing violent video games. Or it could be something else. Going back to the Columbine shooters example, It could be the bullying they experienced that led them to commit the act. And people who are bullied and socially excluded tend to go play video games. It doesn't help that people who play video games are usually struggling in other areas of their life, like their relationships, their grades, their jobs, family, you name it. And now we get to why it is that people play video games. Here's the second misconception, that video games are useless and a waste of time. Us gamers, we get this question a lot. Why do you play video games? And there's many reasons why, but here's a framework you can use to think about why it is you do things. It's called Self-Determination Theory, and it's a theory about motivation and behavior and what drives us to do the things we do. And it believes that we're all trying to fulfill some 3 basic psychological needs. Now, it's been used to explain why we do sports and other things, but it works for video games especially well. The first aspect is something called autonomy. Autonomy relates to our drive to have some control over our lives. We want to feel in control of our future, of our surroundings, of something. And video games fulfill that need. We have a whole world to mess around in, where we can do just about anything we can imagine. We get to influence the course of the narrative in video games, whether it's all pre-set up or up to us to make. We get to feel in control of our character and his actions, and we feel empowered. That's autonomy. The second aspect is something called relatedness. Relatedness is our drive to seek social connection, to be connected and to belong. And the thing about video games is that it's a communal experience in some sense. Because when you play a game, you're not just playing a game. You're being involved in the community of the people around that game. So many video games transcend the game itself. And the online community surrounding that game grows to be something else entirely. That's at least one similarity you share with someone else. Not to mention how the most popular games out there are mostly multiplayer games. Games where you actively play with or against other people, sometimes in teams. The stereotype of the shut-in gamer who doesn't interact with other people is getting less and less accurate throughout the years. Now that's relatedness. The third and final aspect is competence. Competence is our drive to be good at something, to be skilled and knowledgeable. We all want to feel that we're competent in life, that we know how to do things. And video games are the perfect system to show your competence. If you fail a level, it could be because of bad luck or bad RNG, as we gamers would say. But usually it's you and your lack of skill. Video games teach us how to learn, and we get better within the confines of the video game. And you should know that video games improve metacognition, which means thinking about one's own thinking. That's the kind of skills being developed in level-based video games, and there is some translation to real life. So hopefully I cleared up the misconceptions about video games here. Firstly, that video games do not seem to cause violence, and secondly, that video games are not a waste of time, and that they fulfill our basic psychological needs. Why else would video games become even more popular within the pandemic? Now, along the way, we also learned about correlation versus causation, and self-determination theory to help you better understand your behaviors. I think we should stop with the demonizing of video games, and we should be more aware of what drives us to do the things we do. Now, hopefully, you can all apply this outside of video games and in other aspects of your lives. Now, all that being said, I am very aware of how video games can lead to addiction and other problematic behaviors. I'm not being ignorant of that. But my goal for this episode was to address some misconceptions that the public has. At the end of the day, we do things to fulfill our needs, even if we don't really know what those needs are. If there's anything you can take away from this episode, it's that. We do things to fulfill our needs. And the next time you're puzzled by your own behavior, think to yourself, what needs am I trying to fulfill? you.